Cameron, the remote's not working. As I was working on my sermon schedule, my big sermon schedule for this year, when I took a big view of the whole year, I observed that a number of sermons I have, like this morning, has to do with trust. Trusting God. What is one of the promises of God that you find most encouraging? If you want to, you can write it down or text it to me or something, and maybe I'll incorporate it into one of these lessons that I'm going to be given this year on this specific theme. The one that I am using for tonight is from Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5. The Hebrew writer is quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 31 and verse 8, Joshua chapter 1 and verse 5, where he encourages Christians to make sure that our character is free from the love of money, be content with what we have, but the promise that I find encouraging is the last phrase in that verse where God promises, I will never leave you nor forsake you. The power of God's presence. And so we are encouraged by promises like this. In Charles Dickens' story, A Tale of Two Cities, that is set during the French Revolution, there was a little girl who is being taken to prison. And she was in line, and the line headed that direction with a man. They weren't related. And he looked at this little girl, and he asked her if she was scared. And she said, no. But as they continued on, he reached over and she took his hand. And she walked to prison with her hand in his. God promises us His presence. From one perspective, it begins at our birth, when we are born into this world, but in a more appropriate way, it begins when we become Christians. Maybe one of the promises related to God's presence that you find most encouraging comes from the 23rd Psalm, where David writes of God, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil because you are with me. Your rod and your staff comfort me. The power of God's presence. Well, as you saw on the opening screen, tonight I want us to look at Genesis chapter 24 as an illustration of God's powerful presence. I like this chapter, but it is the longest chapter in the book of Genesis, which I find interesting. Now, Moses didn't write Genesis divided up into chapters, and he didn't write it divided up into verses either. That didn't come until 500 to 1,000 years after Christ. But this very long chapter, all of course, has to do with one event. So, the longest chapter in Genesis is not about the creation. It's not about the flood. It's not about God's covenants that He made with Abraham. It's about Abraham finding a spouse for Isaac. God had promised Abraham, of course, in Genesis chapter 12, that God would bless Abraham with a family. 25 years later, God gave Abraham Isaac. But one child does not make a progeny. It does not make a nation, a family of nations, as God had promised Abraham. And so Abraham's son has got to have a family. And that's what Genesis chapter 24 is about. Now, as I was growing up, I had always heard that Abraham sent his servant back to his homeland, Mesopotamia, Padanaram, in order to find a wife who believed in the one true God. That he sent his servant to find a wife that was religiously suitable. The Bible does not say that. In fact, Joshua chapter 24 and verse 2 tells us that Abraham's family were also pagans. And in fact, of course, Laban has household idols, you recall, that Rachel stole when they were leaving. So I don't think it's accurate to say that Abraham sent his servant to find a wife who was religiously compatible. However, I do think the reasoning is similar to that. Okay, so we're in Genesis chapter 24. Back in Genesis chapter 15, God had told Abraham that he was going to punish the Canaanites who were living in the land. Not yet, because their sins had not been complete. But he was going to punish the Canaanites. My opinion is that Abraham wanted to send his servant back to Padanaram, back to his homeland, back to Mesopotamia, to find a woman from a people who was not under God's judgment. God's judgment was on the Canaanites for religious reasons, their idolatry and their immorality. But the text doesn't give us the reason why Abraham sent his servant back to Padanaram for a wife from Isaac. But that's what this whole chapter is about. And I want us to meditate on the confidence that Abraham has and the confidence that he was able to share, to infuse into his servant, that God was going to be with him in this journey. Scene 1, and we're not going to read all the verses in this chapter, but scene 1, let's get the text in front of us. Chapter 24, verse 1. Abraham was old, he was advanced in age. The Lord had blessed Abraham in every way. So God had blessed Abraham in a multitude of ways. He does not yet have a grandson through Isaac, but speaking in general, God had blessed Abraham in every way. So Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he owned, and we don't know if this servant is Eliezer, that we were introduced to back in earlier in Genesis chapter 16, or if it's some other servant. He's the oldest, obviously, of the household. So Abraham said to his servant, he said, please place your hand under my thigh. Scholars do not know what that is. They don't know why he did that. That practice is only mentioned twice, and both of those times are here in the book of Genesis. The guess is that placing the hand under the thigh was close to the reproductive organ, and it had something to do with asking God's blessings on future generations. That's the guess. We don't know. Verse 3. Abraham says to his servant, I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I live, the God of heaven and the God of earth. That's not just a throwaway expression. That is an example of Abraham's faith that the God whom he serves is the God of the whole earth. Keep in mind that pagans believe that gods are limited to a certain area. So we had Zeus, the god of Olympus, and we had Poseidon, the god of the sea, and so forth. But not the one true God, not the God Abraham serves. The God Abraham serves is the God of heaven and earth. And that's the reason why Abraham had confidence that his servant was going to be blessed on his travels outside of the land of Canaan. Verse 4. You will go to my country and to my relatives and take a wife for my son Isaac. The servant said to him, suppose the woman is not willing to follow me to this land. Should I take your son back to the land from where you came? Abraham said to him, beware that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, Jehovah, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my birth, and who spoke to me and who swore to me, saying, to your descendants I will give this land, he will send his angel. You may want to underline that in your Bible. He will send his angel. I'm talking, family, tonight about the fact that God promises us that his presence will always be with us. He'll never leave us and he'll never forsake us. The mention of the angel here is significant because it's repeated. Didn't you have a teacher in school that said, if I say something more than once, that means it's going to be on the test? So Abraham says, God will send his angel before you, and you will take a wife for my son from there. Abraham does not have a whole lot of experience with angels. There was an angel who showed up in the life of Hagar and Ishmael in Genesis chapter 16. And an angel, maybe the same one, showed up in the life of Hagar and Ishmael in Genesis chapter 21. In Genesis chapter 22, Abraham offers his son Isaac. It was the angel of the Lord who spoke to him out of the bush that told him not to kill Isaac and caused a ram to be caught to be offered in the place of Isaac. That's the limit of Abraham's experience with angels. So far as the written text is concerned, that's all experience he's had. I assume that Hagar told him about the angel in chapter 16 and 21 once she got back home. But Abraham believes that God is going to be with him. Abraham says God is going to send his angel before you. Verse 8, if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this my oath. Only do not take my son back there. So the servant, in fact, placed his hand under the thigh of Abraham, his master, and he swore to him concerning this matter. And so Abraham sends his servant to find a spouse for Isaac so that his son can have a family in order for God to bless the world through Abraham's seed. Beginning in verse 10, and we won't read these verses, but in verse 10, the servant takes 10 camels. It's kind of funny that skeptics back in the early 1900s rejected the Bible as being historically accurate because everybody knew that camels were not found in this part of the country. Anytime somebody starts criticizing the Bible, just be patient. Just be patient. Somewhere, somehow, somebody's going to show that man to be a fool. And that's what happened with the skeptics who said that camels were not found in that area. They have, in fact, there's lots of references to camels among the Philistines and the Egyptians and so forth. So the fact that the Bible says there were camels there is historically accurate. Now, camels were a sign of wealth, as you might guess. So the servant took 10 camels, and the reason why Moses mentions the camels is because they're going to play a role in the account. So he takes the camels and he goes to Mesopotamia. This is verse 10. He goes to the city of Nahor, which of course was the brother of Abraham, you remember. And he goes to this well. And I do want to read verses 12 through 14 with you. This is the servant praying. And this is the first prayer in the Bible asking for God's blessings. Now, you and I take that for granted. But here's the first example of it. So their servant says, "O Lord, the God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today." Now that word success, I've got it on the screen as the word prosper, is found a number of times in this text, which illustrates to us that is a key theme that runs through the text. How is God going to bring success to this man who is the servant of Abraham? How is God going to cause Abraham's desire to prosper? So this servant prays, "God, grant me success today and show loving kindness I like the translation loving loyalty, because this word loving kindness carries the idea of loyalty that is motivated out of love and motivates someone to be kind to someone. So the servant says, God, show loving kindness to my master Abraham. Verse 13, behold, I am standing by the spring, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Now, may it be that the girl to whom I say, please let down your jar so that I may drink, and who answers, drink, and I will water your camels also, may she be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac, and by this I will know that you have shown loving kindness to my master. You can call it a test if you want to. The servant, rather, is testing God. He's setting up a scenario here. Now, it would not be uncommon for a woman to offer a man to drink. That would not be uncommon. But to go further than that and say, let me give your camel something to drink, well, then that's going above and beyond. And so the servant sets up this scenario. And he's asking God to provide an answer for him. And he says, if there's a woman who offers to give water to my camels, I don't know when the last time you studied camelology, but a camel can drink as much as 30 gallons of water in 10 minutes. And we've got 10 camels. And the jar that Rebekah was holding held about 3 gallons. So you can imagine how many trips it took from the well to the camel to make sure that camel had drank all it wanted to drink. So this is the scenario that the servant has offered to God. And notice how quickly God starts answering prayers. Look at verse 15. Before he had finished speaking. Family, sometimes before we say in Jesus' name, God's already working to answer our prayers. Do you believe that? Isaiah chapter 65 and verse 24, God says, it will also come to pass that before they call, I will answer, and while they are still speaking, I will hear. Before this servant got finished praying, God was already working. And look at the personality of Rebekah, Isaac's wife. She is a go-getter. First of all, notice how Moses describes her. He gives her genealogy. But notice in verse 16, the girl was very beautiful, a virgin, to emphasize the point. No man had had relations with her. If she's going to be in Abraham's family and she's going to be the mother of the next stage of the seed, it's important that she's a virgin, so that her baby will certainly be from Abraham's descendants and not somebody else. But then I want you to notice from here on, verses 16 through 20, Rebekah is the subject of 11 verbs. I'm telling you, when you read the Bible, you need to read it closely. Picture the personality of this woman. Beginning in verse 16, she went down to the spring. She filled her jar. She came up. The servants asked her to give a drink of water. She said, drink, my Lord. She quickly lowered her jar to her hand. She gave him a drink. She had finished giving him a drink. She said, I will also draw out for your camels until they have finished drinking. Verse 20, she quickly emptied the jar into the trough. She ran back to the well to draw, and she drew for all his camels. Bam, 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 bam. This is the kind of person Rebekah is. Something needs to be done, and so she goes to do it. And look how fast she's doing it. She's got 10 camels she's got to give water to. She is the one. Look at verse 21. The man was gazing at her in silence. We would say his jaw dropped, right? His jaw dropped to know whether the Lord had made his journey successful or not. Well, he sees that she is, in fact, from the family of Abraham. Verse 22, he took a gold ring that weighed half a shekel, 2 bracelets for her wrist weighing 10 shekels in gold. He asked her about her genealogy and finds out that she is from Abraham's family. That ring could have been an earring. The Hebrew word is the same, but in this particular text, it's a nose ring. Now, y'all thought nose rings were something modern, but they ain't. This was a nose ring. I don't know if it was a piercing or what, but so archaeologists have found that bracelets from that time, a ring would weigh about 1/5 of an ounce, and the bracelet would weigh about 4 ounces. They didn't have money at that time. These shekels were small pieces of metal, but this was not stamped money as we have, quarters, nickels, dimes, and pennies. That kind of money didn't come along until Persian Empire. But this was pieces of money that, of course, could be melted down to make tools, to make weapons, to make jewelry, and so forth. So it was obviously still valuable. And one scholar said that an average worker would earn about 10 shekels of silver a year. And this bracelet may have weighed as much as 4 shekels. If that's the case, if those numbers are relevant to this time period, then that's a pretty expensive gift. Almost half a year's salary. Now, to say that he blessed God, as it is said here in verse 26, is to say that he praised God for having blessed him. Let's read verses 26 and 27. The man bowed low and worshiped the Lord. He said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his loving kindness and his truth toward my master. As for me, the Lord has guided me in the way." God has guided me in the way. The way, of course, is an expression for Christianity once we get to the book of Acts, but it's actually used all the way back in the book of Genesis as referring to the path that God has laid out for mankind to follow. So he says, "The Lord has guided me in the way to the house of my master's brothers." And so he blesses God. In other words, he praises God for having blessed him, for God fulfilling this desire, this answering this prayer that he has. And so Rebekah goes back to the house. She tells her family. The family calls him in. And the family sets a big table of food in front of him, hospitality. But the servant won't eat until he tells everybody what's been going on. So verse 33, the food was set before him to eat, and he said, "I will not eat until I have told my business." And Rebekah's brother says, "Say on." And so he said, "I am Abraham's servant," and so forth. From here through verse 44 is one of the longest monologues in the book of Genesis. The servant relating everything, all the details that you and I have just read about. And notice in verse 39 that he relates that he told Abraham, "Suppose the woman does not follow me." Verse 40, Abraham says, "To him, the Lord before whom I have walked, will send his angel with you to make your journey successful." There's our word prosper. "And he will take a wife for my son, for my relatives, and for my father's house. And then you will be free from my oath when you come to my relatives. And if they do not give her to you, you will be free from my oath." So the fact that Abraham and the servant both talk about the angel shows that that's an important part of this event, this account. And the angel, of course, is simply a representative of the presence of God, which is the point I'm trying to emphasize to us tonight. God's presence. Abraham trusted God's presence to be with his servant. The servant trusted God's presence to be with him. Now, when I read these accounts of events in the Old Testament, book of Genesis, I ask myself, why did God record this event for the first generation of Jews Israelites that would receive it, which were the Jews at Mount Sinai. What were they supposed to learn from this? And because God put that in the Bible, then subsequent generations of Jews and we as Christians ask ourselves the same question: why did God record this for us to have? What are we supposed to learn from this? Well, angels, of course, do serve Christians. Some way, somehow, somewhere, Hebrews 1:14. What exactly they do, we don't know. We don't have to know. We don't need to know. We probably don't need to know. What we do need to know is they serve Christians for God. It's a representative of God's presence. So we need to be reminded through this event that God's presence is always with us, especially for Christians who are living on this side of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. When Jesus promises us in Matthew 28 and verse 20 that He will be with us even to the end of the age. So after the servant has gone through all of the story, and he's recounted how Rebekah gave water to those 10 camels, that drank 30 gallons apiece, he reported all of that. In verse 45, he says, "Before I had finished speaking in my heart." Sometimes prayer is just talking in your heart. Prayer doesn't have to be verbalized. Prayer doesn't have to be audible. Prayer is just talking in your heart. And that illustrates the point here. He said, "Before I had finished speaking in my heart, Rebekah came." And so verse 48, he says, "I bowed down and I worshiped the Lord." And then Laban, who is Rebekah's brother, Bethuel, who is her father, verse 50, replied, "The matter comes from the Lord." Now you'll notice in your text perhaps that Lord, L-O-R-D, is all capital letters, which is Jehovah's name, the name of Jehovah God, the true God. Where did Laban learn about Jehovah? Why is he using the distinctive name of God that was Israel's name for God? I don't know. Again, there was idolatry going on in that family, but he still recognized Jehovah God because he uses his name. He says, "The matter comes from the Lord, so we cannot speak to you but bad or good. Here is Rebekah before you. Take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken." So Laban is willing to do what God has said to do. That's good. We'll do what God says to do. They spend the night. And then the next morning, Mama and older brother are getting cold feet about sending their daughter away. I kind of feel for them. So they said, look at verse 55. The brother and mother said, "Let the girl stay with us a few days, say 10. Afterwards she may go." And the servant said in verse 56, "Do not delay me, since the Lord has prospered my way." There's our verb, success. He's given me success. "Send me away that I may go to my master." Brother and mom said, verse 57, "We will call the girl and consult her wishes." When you read the Bible, read it carefully. Modern critics of the Bible want to accuse Bible writers of being misogynistic and patriarchal to the extent that women have no rights and they're not respected and they're just like cattle. And that ain't true. Notice here that Laban and Mama ask Rebekah, "What do you want to do?" Laban is not some kind of misogynistic patriarch that's making Rebekah do what Laban wants her to do. That's not the society the Bible records. That's the society of leftist, feminist in 21st century America, but it's not the society the Bible records. "We will call the girl and consult her wishes," verse 58. They called Rebekah and said to her, "Will you go with this man?" And she said, "I will go. It's entirely in your court. You make the decision." She said, "I'll go." So they sent away their sister Rebekah and her nurse with Abraham's servant and his men. The servant of Rebekah, if it's the same one, is the woman named Deborah. Maybe you recall Deborah in the account of Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Esau later on in the book of Genesis. Rebekah is going to prove to be a strong woman, as you might have already seen indicated in the text. She shows up a major role in chapter 25 and in chapter 27. After Genesis chapter 27, we don't see or hear anything else from Rebekah except references back to these kinds of events. Now, incidentally, these words to the servant from Abraham are the last recorded words of Abraham here in Genesis chapter 24. He dies in the next chapter, chapter 25. So on the way back home, the servant has Rebekah. This is verse 61. In the meantime, verse 62, Isaac has gone out to meditate. If you want God's powerful presence in your life, you've got to pray. You've got to meditate. This is the only time this word is found in the Old Testament. So we're not exactly sure what he was doing, but it's an easy assumption that he was praying. So he goes out and he's meditating in the field towards evening. He lifts up his eyes. He looks. There's camels coming. Rebekah, verse 64, lifts up her eyes. She sees Isaac. She dismounts from the camel. She says to the servant, "Who is the man walking in the field to meet us?" And notice the servant says, "He is my master." Well, I thought Abraham was the master. Well, things are beginning to shift to the next generation. Again, Abraham dies in the next chapter, chapter 25. Isaac is now the master. Isaac is now the head of the household. And so he's the master. She took her veil and covered herself. Verse 66, the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent. To bring her into the tent, in essence, was the marriage ceremony. He is saying that Rebekah now is the matriarch of the family, as I am the patriarch of the family. So he brings her into Sarah's tent. He took Rebekah and she became his wife, and he loved her. The very first time the Bible used the verb to love is in Genesis chapter 22 and verse 1. Where God tells Abraham, "I want you to take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and offer him as a burnt offering." That's the first time the verb love is used in the Bible. This is the second time in describing the love that a husband has for his wife. So Isaac loved Rebekah. And notice at the very end of the chapter, Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. Sarah died when Isaac was 37. Isaac marries Rebekah when he's 40. I do not normally associate a 37-year-old man having trouble dealing with his mom's loss, but Isaac did. Isaac struggled with his mom's death for 3 years before his marriage to Rebekah comforted him in that loss. There was a young man in the youth group when I was a youth minister in Tennessee. He did not do this while he was in the youth group. It was after he had grown up and gone. We had already gone to Romania and moved back. His mom died. This young adult man, now mid-20s, committed suicide because he couldn't deal with the loss of his mom. Isaac was struggling with the loss of his mom for 3 years. God blessed him with a wife. And of course, Isaac and Rebekah have Jacob and Esau, and the promised seed continues because God's got to bring Jesus into the world. Now, another thing that's interesting in this text is that, number one, we don't see God doing anything. And number two, even though Abraham and the servant have mentioned the angel, we don't see the angel doing anything. It's an example of the providence of God. God working behind the scenes in order to accomplish the prayer of one of his servants. That's exactly what God does today. God's not going to bless us miraculously as he did Zacharias and Elizabeth as we studied this morning. But God doesn't have to work miracles in order to be working. He will work behind the scenes in order to accomplish what he knows is best for us in our lives. And so we need to trust him. What's your favorite promise in the Bible? Share it with me. We've got to trust God's promises. We've got to pray. What does your heart desire? Set it out there in front of the throne of God's grace. Sometimes people say, well, I would like this, I would like that, but I'm not sure it's what God wants for me. You let God decide that. Set that prayer out there in front of God's throne and let him and his grace and mercy decide what's best for you. Put it out there. Let God know what you would like, what you need. And so this account from Genesis chapter 24, which now is a historical event that's thousands of years old, teaches us that we need to walk by faith. Hebrews 13 and verse 5. I will never leave you, and I will never forsake you. God might be sending an angel right now before you're finished praying to bless you in your life. We don't know. But we've got to trust. If you're finding it hard to trust, the shepherds here would love to pray for you. Your church family wants to pray for you and encourage you. But we don't know what we don't know. If we can help, tell us while we stand and sing.